I
Yeah.
hope so. Excellent. All right. So, welcome everybody. You have tuned into the Budgeting Basics workshop. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I'm Professor Crosby. Well, last quarter I taught a little bit of everything. Typically, the courses I tend to teach the most are research methods. I think I might have some of you in the research methods course next quarter. I'm teaching MPPA 401 research methods in the winter. Or if, for those of you who either want to take me for that course or don't want to take me for that course, you can do that. I'm also teaching the full budgeting course in the spring quarter. So again, after this workshop, you can either decide you really want to take a class with me or you really don't, and you can either take my class in the spring or you can not. So I will be teaching the full version of this course in the spring as well. But so we'll get to that in just a moment. But so just to kind of an idea, this won't be a 2.5 hour long session, I don't believe. Generally, most of these sessions won't be, but feel free to ask questions at any point. I'd like to make this as interactive as possible. And we will, I do record these workshops, so in case you can't show up one day, that's fine, don't worry about it, you can always watch it online. I like to kind of treat these workshops as kind of think about it as an all-you-can-eat buffet. You can come grab something if you want. If you're really interested in a topic, go ahead and sign on for the night. If you're really not interested in the topic, or maybe you've got a conflict for the night, that's fine. You can go ahead and watch the videos. Attending in person does have the benefit of having, you could ask questions, and I'm always happy to work through examples with you. But you'll always have the video to be able to be watched as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about me first. We'll do some quick introductions about you as well. There is a discussion board as well, just to introduce yourself. I'll tell you a little bit about the workshop, then we'll go into the day one discussion, which is kind of a broad overview of what budgeting is and kind of what we're going to, kind of a foundation for the rest of the course. Or workshop, I should say. I'm sure I will call this a course several times. It is not an actual course, it's a workshop, but I'll call it a course, I'm sure. As some of you who have had me in class know, I'll also call it a semester, I'm sure, sometimes. It's something it's like the habit that I can't kick. And then we'll kind of do a prelude to the next session. So a little bit about me first. I am Dr. Crosby. I have a PhD in public administration from the school across town, University of Illinois at Chicago. There I studied financial management survey methods. You may guess the fact that I have a PhD in financial management with a concentration in financial management is probably why you have me for this workshop. I do also occasionally teach kind of mini sessions in survey methods, or for those of you who take MPPA 401 with me, you'll also learn about designing surveys in that course. I have a Master of Public Administration myself from Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Before the life of academia, I was a researcher at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois. I was part of the Fiscal Futures team, and basically what that team was we would work with state government to deal with state budget issues that popped up. So when you heard headlines such as, there's going to be $10 billion unpaid bills this year for the state of Illinois, we were part of the team that created projections for that. We weren't necessarily the ones that came up with policy necessarily, but we were hopefully influencing policy by warning that, hey, we're going to have some problems financially. Illinois is a very challenging state financially at some points in time. It's had some rough times, but it's also had some better times. So that's what I did previous to that. I've worked in local government before as well. A small suburban municipality named Walker, Michigan. Worked there for a little while. Did a little bit of everything there. Worked for the city manager's office. Worked for the planning department. Did a little bit of everything there. Even with a city engineer. My research interests, state and local finance, emergency financial management. So when you think of Flint, Michigan, and the health crisis that Flint had, a lot of that was financially driven. So that was something I'm particularly interested in. And then methodology. So those of you who have had me for 401 know I'm really interested in surveys. So as it turns out, if you ask somebody a survey question, how you ask that question will impact a lot of times how people answer that question. So that's something I'm really interested in as well. So that's a little bit about me. We have a nice sized group here. I'm showing 5 of us. So why don't we just take just a moment before we go into the workshop? We will talk about the workshop, but why don't we just take just a moment and we can introduce everybody in the Zoom call here, and then we do have an introduction on the discussion board as well. But it's nice to have to get to know everybody in person when we've got it. Well, kind of in person, virtually in person. So why don't we go through just briefly and introduce ourselves? I'm just going to call out names in the order that they're listed on my Zoom roster here. So we'll start with Isabel. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Isabel. I'm currently in Chicago, but I grew up in Michigan and like the Metro Detroit area. So I earned my bachelor's in social work at Michigan State. I graduated in 2020. And then, of course, I'm in the MPPA program right now. I have one more quarter. And then I start my thesis. And I'm specifically focused in education policy and specifically like non-academic factors. So school climate, chronic absenteeism, nutrition. And then right now I'm working in recruitment for a nonprofit that's comparable to Teach for America. It's called Saga Education. And then I'm also a data evaluation intern for Teach Plus, which is like a teacher fellowship program to get teachers involved in policy.
Wonderful. It's great to have you in the workshop. All right. Next on the list, we've got Amir.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amir. I am a slow-moving part-time student. So this is I'm coming into my 3rd year of the program. And so I did my BA in political science at UNLV. I grew up in Las Vegas. I am originally from Chicago and I'm here now, but a majority of my life is back in the West Coast. And so my focus has slowly been turning into environmental policy, although I'm officially under like the global policy focus. And so I'm still interested like in international affairs and comparative policy and politics. And so, yeah, look forward to working with you all.
Very nice. Thank you, Amir. Next on the list, we've got Eleanor.
Hi, everyone. Amir, don't feel bad at all. It's taken me 5 years and I'm on the edge of my seat to see if I pass my capstone. So I should find out sometime this week. I'll let you guys know.
Very exciting.
Yeah, I have a consulting business in the greater New Haven area in Connecticut. Although I did make a trip out to Chicago this past summer just to touch the rock, touch that big purple rock and feel, somewhat connected to campus. And because my youngest son wanted to see make some college visits, including Northwestern. And I'm interested in how cultural scenes form and the impact of cultural scenes, and I'm doing a cultural assets mapping project right now, and the impact of that on economic development in municipalities. And I consider myself to have a pretty big math verbal gap. I did qualitative research in undergrad in anthropology. So any extra numbers support I can get is a very big help. So thank you for doing this workshop.
Wonderful. Well, great to have you with us. And I wasn't too far from you. Actually, I was at Pace University. I worked at Pace University for 5 years, and I was actually teaching on the Pleasantville campus. Not too far from New Haven, in fact.
That's right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Small world.
Yep.
Wonderful to have you. All right. Next on the list, we've got Jessica.
Hi, everyone. So I do a lot of work around healthcare, expanding access to healthcare, saving programs, fighting to save programs like Medicaid, the ACA. So I work with Protect Our Care Coalition and the Healthcare Rights Coalition. I did my undergrad at Northwestern. Years ago, I got a BS in political science and, a BS in communications, a second major in political science. And I took 402 a couple quarters ago, and I was motivated to take this workshop because I'd had bad experiences working in nonprofit where organizations were genuinely doing important work, but companies went under for silly reasons. And it showed me what I didn't want to do. And so I'm actively trying to avoid doing those things. And so I figure learning budgeting will help me.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's a great point. We'll actually talk about nonprofit organizations several times throughout the workshop, but you're right. You get some nonprofits with wonderful missions and wonderful services that they provide to their constituents, and then financially don't make it, or there's a problem financially, somebody gets in trouble for something, or there's the accounting was done wrong, and it's sad to see, because you would think, okay, these organizations are doing such great things, and you don't want to see bad things happen. So it's very good to have you in the workshop, and hopefully it will be useful. All right, and last but not least, we have Stephanie.
Hey, good evening, everyone. I apologize, my video is not working. I was trying so hard, Professor, to get it in the past 10 minutes or so. Stephanie Megas. I currently live in Denver, Colorado, but spent the last close to 10 years in Ohio. I have an undergraduate degree from the College of Worcester in political science, and I spent several years after I graduated in Columbus. I worked at the state legislature and at City Hall, both times for elected officials. So I have general experience with budgets, but more from a high level kind of political aspect, not really in the nitty gritty details. After those experiences, I worked in government affairs for the telecom provider in Columbus. And I just recently started a new role with S&P Global in their rating, U.S. Public Finance Ratings Group. So I really do need to dig further into this. I'm knee deep in audits, or at least since I started. So any more information and kind of technical training on the budget side, I will take. So thank you for having me and putting on the workshop.
Absolutely, and wonderful to have you, and that's great to hear, because we will actually talk about bond ratings, and we'll actually talk about Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, and we'll actually talk about that in the context of the state of Illinois, which has got one of the lowest ratings of all states in the country. S&P, for those of you who are not familiar, is one of 3 credit rating agencies, along with Moody's and Fitch, and does great work that assesses basically creditworthiness of governments and lots of other things, but in particular for our interest in governments. So we will talk more about that. So great to have you. All right, so that brings us to what exactly we're going to cover. So what do we do in this workshop? So we're going to cover the basics of budgeting for a lot of different things. And so we're going to cover differences. We're going to talk about revenues and expenditures. So where's the money come from? Where's the spending happening in public organizations? So that includes governments, but it also includes nonprofit organizations, health organizations. We'll talk about an introduction to public sector accounting. We'll talk about reading financial documents. So when we're talking about going through audits or going through financial statements or even going through budgets, we'll talk about those. As it turns out, most organizations produce some sort of financial document, whether it's the annual comprehensive financial report for a municipality or a state, or it could be the IRS Form 990 for a nonprofit. These are all different names. You'll get to be familiar with these documents. We're actually going to talk a lot more about reading financial documents in the next course, which is an exciting thing. Well, it's an exciting thing to me, and I hope it will be to you as well, because you really get to know where the money's coming from and where the spending's happening. You listen to politicians all the time say, I'm going to cut the waste and fraud in government. Well, are you? Well, would you like to tell me where that is? So you've got to be able to know where that actually is and what's the government spending money on, what's the government getting money from, or a nonprofit organization. Again, you hear the same promises. We're going to cut the waste. Are you? Where's that coming from? So we're going to talk about reading financial documents a lot more next week. We'll talk about capital budgets. So this is planning for the long term, buying things like bridges, buildings, things that are going to last a long time. The kind of key thing about capital budgets is they last things that are lasting a long time and over the long term. We're going to use real world data throughout the seminar. So we're going to look at actual financial reports. I'm not making these data up. We're going to use computer applications. So we'll talk about Microsoft Excel. This is not a class in Excel, but we'll talk about Excel and how to use Excel. It's one of the more popular tools you'll see in budgeting. So that's the workshop itself. So this is a very boots on the ground oriented workshop. It has less of the theoretical approach, which is more the full budgeting class, and more of the applied approach. So this is, in fact, not MPPA 402. That is a full quarter-long course. I've got that quarter-long course, the description here on your screen. So that talks more about the budget theories, some of the methodology used in budgeting, some practices, but it does include more theory, kind of budget history, role of interest groups, the political process of budgeting. Not that we won't talk about that, but this is a more applied workshop. So this is not quite the same as MPPA 402. Again, if you do want to take that, you could take it potentially in the winter quarter. I am not teaching it in the winter quarter. I believe Seth Payton is teaching it in the winter quarter, and then I am teaching it in the spring quarter. If you really want to take the course with me, we will cover some of this material in the spring quarter, but we'll add a lot to it because it's obviously a 10-week long quarter instead of a 1-week long seminar. So we'll see. Again, there's some commonality between the workshop and the full class, but there's quite a bit of difference. Again, this is much more of a boots on the ground approach to budgeting. Just to give you a sense of exactly even more detail of what we're going to cover. So it's a 7-day long workshop. I've got this on the syllabus posted to Canvas as well. So again, today we're going to talk kind of an overview. What is budgeting? What are budget cycles? What's the difference between public sector budgeting and private sector budgeting? Kind of an overview. Next workshop is in tomorrow. We'll talk about reading financial documents. So that's the annual financial report, IRS Form 990s, audits. Day 3, we're going to talk about accounting. So what's the difference between, for example, accrual accounting, cash accounting, modified accrual accounting. Talk about inflation. That's kind of the big topic in the news right now. You can't turn on the news without hearing about inflation. Pretty big deal right now. So what is inflation? How do we know what inflation is? What can we do about it? There's a lot of talk right now about the Fed, the Federal Reserve. That's when we talk about monetary policy. That's the Fed at work. Day 4, we're going to talk about where's the money coming from. So how do you raise money in terms of income taxes, payroll taxes, and property taxes? Or if you're a nonprofit, what do these mean for you? We'll talk about transaction-based revenue sources. So these are things like sales taxes. Day 5, we'll talk about capital budgeting. So again, that's the long term. It's things like bridges, roads, buildings. We'll talk about depreciation, which is how our assets wear out over time. Day 6, talk about spending. Now, since we talked about revenues, what do we spend money on? Things like, obviously spending on personnel, but also retirement benefits, pensions, 401ks, 403bs, OPEB, which is other post-employment benefits. We're going to talk about all those types of things. These are pensions you hear in the news all the time, particularly in Illinois. Day 7, we're going to talk about debt. So when we talk about S&P, Moody's, Fitch, these are all credit rating agencies. These are very much involved. These agencies are very much involved when for example, a municipality wants to issue bonds. They're borrowing money. So we'll talk about debt, and we'll wrap up the workshop. So this is the general schedule. I will hold a live session every night, and I generally approach it as kind of think about it as an all-you-can-eat buffet. You can come to as many or as few workshops as you want live. I will record them, so if you miss something in this workshop, you'll have a recording. Generally takes about an hour or two for Zoom to process it after we log off, so it takes a little bit to process. I'll upload it to the Canvas site, usually by midnight the same night, unless there's some Zoom processing issue, but usually by midnight the same night. So by the midnight tonight, you'll be able to watch this video. If you want to go back, look through something, you can do that. But stop by. You can more than welcome to attend every workshop night, or if you're really interested in some parts of it, you can attend on those nights and watch the other videos. That's totally fine. So your choice. There are 3 assignments in the course, but the assignments are not graded. The first assignment is due, so to speak, on Wednesday, and that really mostly deals with reading financial documents. If you for some reason can't get to the assignment, it's okay. Again, this workshop is not graded, but it does, by going through the assignment, it'll allow you to practice and then allow me to give you feedback. So I'm not giving you you got an A, you got a B, but I'll at least tell you, here's what we did, here's what you could have done potentially a little bit different. So for example, our first assignment is looking at a financial statement, understanding where the top revenues and expenditures are for foreign organizations. Where's the money coming from for an organization? Where's the spending coming from? Does that organization have a deficit, a surplus? What do they have in terms of a fund balance, which is, if you kind of think about it, like a little bit like a savings account. So that's what the first assignment is. Again, very hands-on, doesn't take a long time. You could probably get through it in an hour. So don't worry about these a lot, but they're just practice to get you, feeling like you understand the material. Again, if you don't turn in the assignment by the day it's due, no worries. The seminar is not graded, but then you won't end up being able to get feedback on what you did. So it's up to you, again, how many of these you want to do. Generally, students find them pretty useful because, again, they're pretty short. You can probably complete it in an hour, but it's nice practice. It's one thing to watch me talk about it, and as exciting as I may be, you will likely learn more by doing it. So those are just nice ways to do it, to get some practice. Generally, I'll get your assignments graded to you within about 2 days. So your day 3 assignment, I'll get back to you by the end of the day on day 5. Day 5, I'll get to you by day 7. And then day 7, I'll get you 2 days after the workshop ends. Any questions about the schedule? And again, I'll hold the live workshops every day of the workshop, but feel free to tune in on all of them, some of them, none of them. Obviously, you're not in the none category if you've already tuned in, but feel free to tune in as often or as little as you want. I enjoy talking with you all, especially if you got questions. Happy to work through examples. So that's our schedule. I am going to use some materials that I get from a textbook. It's not a traditional course, so I'm not going to ask you to read the textbook, but if you're interested in public budgeting in particular, and you want a good background, or if you're taking 402 with me in the spring, this is the textbook that I'll use, and it's a good textbook because it's written in a pretty accessible manner. There's several public budgeting textbooks out there. There's a classic one by John Mikesell, which is more from an economics point of view. That one's a little harder to read. It's got some nice examples, but it's a little harder to read. This particular book just came out. It's, I believe, a 2021 imprint. So it actually has a little bit of a section on COVID as well. It's by Lee, Johnson, and Joyce. I've got a picture of Phil Joyce here. He's the primary author now, even though he's listed last. He's actually at the University of Maryland. He's now in administration. But he's a really well-known scholar. All of these authors are really well-known scholars. So if you're really interested in, hey, I want to know a little bit more, it's a nice reference. Even if you were never going to take a budgeting class again, this book is in its 10th edition now. Even if you find an old edition of this book, it's really nice. It's just a reference. You're like, hey, how was it the taxes were calculated anyway? You can often find old editions of this textbook for very, very cheap. But so just to let you know that some of the material I'll draw is from this textbook, just because it gives a nice accessible introduction. But you do not need to buy it, but it is something you can get if you'd like. Grading and assignments, again, just as I mentioned, since this is a workshop, you won't receive a formal letter grade, but I will provide you feedback on assignments throughout the workshop. So you can submit them via Canvas. Assignment number 1 is already available. It's due Wednesday. It's going to deal mostly with things we're going to talk about tomorrow, but we will talk a little bit about it tonight, probably enough to where you could get the assignment done if you really wanted to. So if you could probably get this done in an hour, maybe even a little less. They're short assignments, but they're applied practical exercises. So Wednesday, Friday, Sunday are those assignments. Again, if you don't turn it in, don't stress. Again, it's not a graded workshop, but the main consequence is if you don't turn it in, late assignments don't get feedback. Questions about assignments? All right. Attendance, participation, again, it's a fully online course. You don't have to come to campus at all. You've got the option to attend synchronous sessions every night. Canvas discussion boards. We've got the on Canvas discussion board. There's a getting to know you section. There's also a question section if you want to ask a question that you think others might have that we can learn from each other. That's great. You can feel free to ask a question there. You're also welcome to email me. I'll provide my email at the end of this presentation, but it's also in the syllabus. Email me if you got a question as well. Also, you can also just show, anytime you want to show up to any of these seminars, you can just, tune in at 7 o'clock. You got questions to ask. I'll generally just allow the first, 5 or 10 minutes to be questions. And if we have more questions, we can even go longer than that. So, again, although attendance is not required, you're encouraged if you can. But again, I get that everybody's busy, so don't feel bad. You don't have to apologize if you can't attend. But just a little bit on that. So this class, I called it a class again. It's a workshop. This particular workshop tonight is really an introduction. We're going to talk about what's budgeting broadly. And then at the end, I want to start practicing something that's going to get us into the next tomorrow's lecture. So what is public budgeting? So this is actually the budget of the U.S. government. It's actually posted to Canvas if you want it, in the fiscal 22 budget. Now, you notice when you open that up, it's gigantic. So is the state of Illinois budget. So is the city of Chicago budget. Budgets are complicated documents and very long and detailed documents. And that's by design. So what is a budget? First, we can go into that. What's a budget? It's a document, collection of documents, refers to the financial condition and future plans of the organization. Key word there is plan. Budget is a plan. What are we going to do? How are we going to spend our money? Where are we going to get the money? Whether that's a government, a nonprofit organization, we need to have some idea of where we're going to get the money and how we're going to spend it. In governments, that's usually things like taxes. You get money through taxes. In a nonprofit organization, you may have donations. Maybe you've got contracts. Some nonprofits have contracts with governments. You may also, let's say you're a health organization, you may charge fees. Somebody comes to the hospital, you're going to charge them to see them. So there may be charges for services or fees. There's lots of different ways to raise money. But then we can spend money on lots of different things too. Government, we might spend it on, fire department, parks, lots of options there. Nonprofit organization, maybe we're providing program services. Hospital, we're providing, patient care. So again, budget is a plan. Where are we going to get the money? What are we going to spend it on? If you were to condense down what is a budget to one word, it's a plan. Now, budgeting is pretty common. I cannot speak tonight, apparently. So it's common. Everybody does budgeting. You all probably have a personal budget. Maybe some of you do. Maybe some of you don't. Maybe some of you just, go as play it by ear. But most people have some sort of a budget. You have an idea of, how much rent you're going to pay. You have an idea of how much you're going to spend on groceries. You have an idea of this. Now, of course, are there variations? Can you go to the grocery store and spend more than you expected? Yeah, especially now. We've had some inflation. Costs have gone up. You go to the grocery store, it costs you more now than it did. But you had an idea of how much you're going to spend on groceries for that month. So you did a budget. You also have probably an idea of how much money you're going to make in a month or a year. You have some sort of idea what's going on. So just like a public budget, your personal budget is also a plan. It's a means for setting goals. So, what am I going to do? What do I want to do? Okay, well, I've got a job, as a employee at City Hall, and I'd like to buy a house. Okay, well, that's a goal, right? So you can save up money for it. Maybe your budget allows you to save up some money to buy a house. That's a goal. It's a plan. You want to buy a house. That's how you're going to do it, right? So just like private budgeting, there are similarities between public and private budgeting. It's, again, a budget is a manifestation of an organization's strategy, so it's a plan. Your budget and the public budget are a little different, but it's a plan, fundamentally. And this then brings us to a very famous thing, and if you've taken 402, I hope you've heard this question at some point. The fundamental budget question. This is really what we're really doing when we do budgeting. And it's a very famous quote attributed to V.O. Key. On what basis shall it be decided to allocate X dollars to activity A instead of activity B. So the idea here is that we can't spend money on everything we want. You can't buy a house. You can't buy and buy a vacation rental and buy this and buy that. You have to decide. You have to come up with priorities and decide what you're going to spend the money on. Your income is also not unlimited, but you have to decide how you're going to get income. Am I going to get a job doing this, that, or the next thing? You all are getting master's degrees, so hopefully that master's degree will eventually increase your income. I certainly hope it doesn't decrease your income. That would make me very sad. But this is fundamentally what we're doing. We're trying to decide, okay, on what basis shall we decide to allocate money to one activity over another? Same thing as your personal budget again. Okay, I'm not going to go out to eat this month because I'm saving up to buy a house or a condo or whatever it is. Okay, well that's, again, you've decided to allocate money to saving towards a condo instead of going out to eat. That's fine. You can do that. Now, here are the big differences. So now I've told you for the last 2 slides that public and private budgeting are not that different, but they are. One of the big differences between public and private sector budgeting is resource availability. So if you don't have money, you don't have money, you have a couple of options. You can, cut spending, which is obviously you can spend less money on things like, I'm not going to go out to eat. You could also get a job, another job, let's say, or a different job, right? So you're working and you say, I don't make enough money. Maybe you go get a master's degree. Now you have a different job, or you get a second job, or whatever it is. You have some ability to raise more money. But government in particular has a lot of ability to raise money. How does it do that? Taxes, right? So state of Illinois in particular. State of Illinois wants more money. It can then raise taxes. You personally don't have the ability to raise taxes to get more income. Although, wouldn't that be cool? If you could just say, I need more money for this month's budget, I'm going to raise taxes and people are just going to pay me. That would be a nice way for your own personal life. And some organizations have more ability to do this than others. Government has a pretty strong ability to get money through taxes. States, in particular, the federal government, have virtually unlimited power. If you're the federal government, you could really raise taxes as much as you want, within reason. State government, a little less ability, local government, less than that, but you have the ability to raise taxes. Now, if you're a nonprofit organization, it may be harder. If you're a nonprofit, you can't raise taxes. But maybe you can go out and solicit additional donations, for example. Hospitals can raise prices, but again, within some limit. Hospitals can't charge whatever they want. So you can see there's a difference in resource availability between public sector budgeting and private sector budgeting. Same thing is true with companies. If you're Apple can sell more products, but Apple can't raise taxes in order to make more money. So government in particular has virtually unlimited resource availability, whereas private sector, not so much. Another difference is profit motive. Governments do things in particular, and some nonprofits do as well, things that are financially unprofitable. So, a park. Chicago in particular has a lot of parks. If you're in New York, New Haven, lots of parks there too. It's not profitable to run parks. People just walk into the park, they use it, walk their dog, whatever it may be, and then they leave. It's not profitable to run that park. It costs money to run the park. Now we finance it through taxes, but it's not profitable. Government does things that are not profitable. Nonprofits do as well, sometimes. So, resource availability is one big difference, profit motive is another. There's also differences in service provided, right? Again, if you're talking about parks versus, say, iPhones, that's a pretty big difference. So there are some differences between public and private sector budgeting. It's also harder to both inaugurate programs and eliminate them in the public sector. So for those of you who might remember when the Affordable Care Act came around in the earlier 2000s, it was quite a process to get that act passed. And it was a result of years and decades of efforts to pass a more comprehensive health care act. So it was very difficult to pass that, the Affordable Care Act. But you all also may remember, more recently, there have been efforts to repeal either parts or all of the Affordable Care Act. That's also very difficult. So although it was very, very difficult to get the act passed in the first place, it's also almost just as hard to get rid of the act, right? So in the public sector, once you've got something going, it's really hard to stop doing that thing, whatever that thing is. Now that we have the Affordable Care Act, it's really hard to imagine, okay, we're going to go back to not having, for example, we've talked, you hear this in political debate, for example, pre-existing condition coverage, right? There was a time at which pre-existing conditions were not necessarily covered. Now with the Affordable Care Act, they are. So that's one big thing that usually comes up when we talk about eliminating the Affordable Care Act is what would we do about pre-existing conditions? So it's really hard to get programs going, and it's also really hard to stop programs. You know, think about things like Social Security. We always have these arguments about Social Security. Like it's going to crash and burn, we're going to lose Social Security. Well, we probably won't, because again, it's a very popular program at this point. It's hard to get a program like Social Security going, but it's also hard to stop. So, whereas if you're Apple, and you're making the iPhone, you don't like this model, or you get, antenna gate or whatever problem you might have with your iPhone, okay, well, we'll just stop making that model. We'll change it. Private sector, you can do that. Can't do that with the public sector, not very easily. So these are all differences between public and private sector budgeting. And there are things to kind of think about. So next week, in the next session, rather, and we're actually going to talk about this at the end of the night tonight, when you think about, like, let's say now that we've had COVID, a lot of organizations have had to think about what are we going to do to maintain the budget? And one of the questions is, all right, if we want to cut spending, then where? You're going to cut spending on parks during COVID? Where people want to go outside? Probably not. You're going to cut spending on things like the fire department, schools? Those are very unpopular things to cut spending on. So we're going to look at financial documents, at least introduce them tonight and say, well, where would we cut something anyway? So, okay, before I go forward, how does everybody feel so far? What budgeting is, the difference between public and private sector budgeting. Feeling okay so far? I see thumbs up. Excellent. All right. So I want to briefly just talk about this. We will talk about capital budgeting much more later in a couple of courses or a couple of sessions. But there's also different types of budgets. So the budget you often hear of most commonly is the operating budget, and that's just the budget for the year. It's a short-term plan. What are we going to do for the next year? Illinois does. They use so you get an operating budget, but again, you also have something called a capital budget. Capital budget is our long-term plan. Things like, again, roads, bridges, buildings, things that are going to be around a long time and take a while. Because you don't build a bridge overnight. You don't build a highway overnight. You don't build a rail line overnight. So capital budget, we're thinking long-term, long-lasting assets. Your operating budget is, hey, short-term plan, this is what we're going to do in the next year. Just to give you that distinction. Now, budget cycles. So we also have, once we're thinking about budgeting, how do these budgets come to be? Well, there's four kind of phases. One is that we've got to prepare the budget and submit it. Two is that we've got to have approval of the budget. Three, we need to actually execute the budget, i.e. we need to actually do the budget. And then four, we need to have an audit or evaluation of the budget. So did we actually do what we said we were going to do in the budget? Did we stay within the budget? That's what that is. I'm going to briefly go through each one of these. By the way, this particular workshop has more background information than any of them. So this is pretty much the extent of the background information we're going to get. Then we're going to get into the fun stuff. So budget preparation first. So who prepares the budget? Generally, it's the executive. So, and there's lots of executives. I've got the president here on the screen. He's pretty happy. He's smiling about the budget. Everybody smiles about the budget. How could you not? So this is where we've got the target of most reforms. So in fact, the president of the United States in particular must submit a budget. There's actually a U.S. code that requires that. So President Biden has to submit a budget. Now, you probably know this if you've seen federal budgets or any state budgets. These budgets get presented by the executive and have just about zero chance of actually passing as proposed. They're modified very heavily, but the executive comes forth first and says, here's a budget that I would propose. So again, when I say executive, that's the president of the United States, the governor of a state, a hospital CEO, executive director at a nonprofit, some executive. Now, there's some variation that does occur. We have different models of governments in which there's not always the executive doing the budget, but usually it's the executive doing a budget. And so again, President Biden proposes the budget. If you're in Illinois, Governor Pritzker proposes a budget. If you're in Chicago, Mayor Lightfoot proposes a budget. Lots of executives propose these budgets. So that's phase one, proposing the budget. Again, usually an executive function. Phase two, budget approval. That's the legislature. So that is, for example, Congress in the United States government. The legislature of state of Illinois, city council in the terms of Chicago or a locality, New Haven City Council. So again, budget is prepared by the executive and then submitted to the legislature, and that legislature then approves it, which could be, again, Congress, could also be a school board, a nonprofit board. There's lots of different legislative bodies that could approve this budget. But we start with the executive, then we go to this legislative deliberative body. The legislative body may often hold hearings. So you will often see City of Chicago is holding budget hearings. That's pretty common. We have a lot of debate. We want to get input on the budget. Schools, same thing. Hey, what do we want to do on the budget? We're going to hold hearings in the budget. So this is phase two, budget approval. So now it's proposed by the executive, then it goes to the legislative body. That legislative body then debates and ultimately, hopefully, approves the budget. Then we need to step three. We need to do the budget. So like phase one, this is mostly phase three. This budget execution is mostly an executive responsibility. So again, executive execute. That kind of the word goes together. So yeah, again, this is the president is responsible for executing the budget at the federal level, the governor at the state level, the mayor at the city level, nonprofit executive director. So now we've got money to spend. We got to actually spend it. And some, depending on control, can be pretty extensive. So if the budget is passed for this purpose, then you need to spend it on this purpose. You can't just spend it on anything you want. So that's execution. Typically, we start execution with the beginning of what's called the fiscal year. Now you may say, well, wait, what's the fiscal year? Isn't the year the year? Well, not always. Organizations typically run on what's called a fiscal year, which means that it could be that the fiscal year starts on January 1st and ends on December 31st, which is also known as the calendar year. It could be that. Chicago does that, in fact. But a lot of organizations don't. The federal government runs from October 1st to September 30th. State governments, like Illinois, begins July 1st. So that is the year in which we're spending money. So it may not necessarily overlap with the calendar year, but it will start, for example, July 1st and end on June 30th. That's the period for which we're passing a budget. And the fiscal year is almost always stated on these audited financial statements or a Form 990. And again, we'll get into these in just a minute. Actually, I'm going to show you both examples tonight. And then we're going to talk about them in a whole bunch more detail next session. But the fiscal year should be prominently stated. So it'll say, for the fiscal year ended June 30th, for example. So we're going to talk about this. I say more. See, this is my other thing I'm going to do many times, and I'm going to get it wrong. I'm going to keep saying weeks. It's not next week. Next week, we won't have this workshop. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about this. So, for example, here is the annual comprehensive financial report for the city of Chicago. What this is, and I'm going to show you much more about this both tonight and tomorrow. What this is a guide to all of the finances that are happening in a given organization. So in this case, City of Chicago. And you see the fiscal year is prominently listed here for the year ended December 31st, 2020. So that means the fiscal year is January 1 through December 31st. It'll tell you that right on the cover, along with a gigantic city seal. So this report is really, really useful. It tells you a bunch of information about the budget. It tells you where the money came from, where the money's going, and this is the retrospective report. This is what happened in the past. The budget is prospective, what we're going to do. The financial report shows us what actually happened. Not only does it show us that, it's actually audited by an outside auditor, often an accounting firm. But that auditor will actually look through this information and say, is this okay? Is it presented, what's called presented fairly? So this is a really nice document to look at. And we're going to focus on parts of it. So you can also figure out fiscal year from a nonprofit. This is what's called the IRS Form 990. So nonprofit organizations don't always have an annual financial report like the one we just looked at. Governments do. Nonprofits sometimes do and sometimes don't, but nonprofits generally do file this tax document, which is, again, called the IRS Form 990. It's basically, if you think about it, it's the nonprofit's version of a tax return. And so what you see here in this case, I've got the United Way on your screen here. It happens to be an older version of this happens to be from a couple years ago, but you'll notice I've circled here. Believe it or not, the document does not come with a big red circle on it. I added that for you. But you see here, for the 2015 calendar year or tax year beginning something. Now they've left it blank, which means it's a calendar year. But what this is just like the annual financial report that you could look for government. This tells you all the stuff that's going on in a nonprofit organization. It's really helpful. It shows you not only what the money is coming from and what the spending is on, but it'll tell you things like, what are the salaries of key employees? Really quite helpful to know, and pretty interesting sometimes. So that's phase 3. We're doing the budget. Phase 4, audit and evaluation. That's the final phase. And what we want to do in this phase is we want to make sure that the executive did what they were supposed to with the budget. The audit location varies. Sometimes it's an accounting firm. At the federal government, it's the GAO, the Governmental Accountability Office. There's lots of different locations, but the key thing here is that we're checking to make sure that the executive complied with what was actually set forth in the budget. Now, I make all that sound like that all happens in one fancy step, or one fancy step-by-step process. It doesn't. There's several cycles happening at any given time. So you might be auditing, for example, let's look at the cycle 1 here. We're executing a budget from January to July, but then we audit that budget year right after that. Well, during that audit, we're also executing the next year's budget. And we might be preparing the year after that. So we might actually have 2 or 3 phases going on at the same time at any given point. So it does, although, yes, those are the phases in which a budget normally progresses, you can get a lot of things happening at once. So before I just jump forward here, I want to go back for just a second. Everybody comfortable with the phases of the budget? Fantastic. All right. Now, one more point here. Not all budgets are annual. 23 states have what's called a biennial budget, which is every 2 years. Now that sounds really neat. Hey, We don't need to prepare a budget every single year. Wouldn't that be great? Allows us some breathing room. Except it's harder to supervise the executive that way. Also, if you have a situation like COVID, you're going to have to make some changes anyway. So not all budgets are annual, but the biennial budget is not maybe all it's hyped to be. Now, I want to introduce you. Eleanor says Connecticut's biennial as well. Yeah, so there's good and there's bad to it. It's nice to have a little bit of breathing room. It's nice to not always be fighting about the budget, but it also, the executive, if the executive's not doing what the executive should be doing, so far in Connecticut we haven't had a lot of problems that I know of from Governor Lamont, but if that were to happen, then you have a harder time catching that very quickly because you now have a 2-year process. Not impossible, though. So this is a prelude, then. Eleanor says we didn't have a state budget for 8 months, and that was a problem. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Before Lamont. Yeah. And Illinois has done the same thing. Illinois has gone a long time without budgets before when we had disagreements in the legislature. And what happens is, universities don't have funding now. Well, that's kind of a problem. We don't want that. So it's a challenge. So this then gets us to kind of our prelude to day 2. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. And again, I don't want these to be long workshops every night because I want you to be able to attend them and then not be exhausted at the end of them and be able to enjoy the rest of your night. So I do want to do a bit of an introduction to tomorrow's talk. Tomorrow we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail. But the kind of questions we're going to start moving forward with is, where's the money come from? Where's the money spent? Are we running a surplus or a deficit? Should we be concerned about that? So what I'm going to do is we are going to look just tonight. There's more of these posted, and some of these are posted to Canvas. I've also got just a link here at the bottom of your screen here. This is an example of an annual comprehensive financial report for the city of Evanston. So this is where Northwestern's main campus is based. And these are generally published every year by a government, and again, nonprofit organizations publish on 990. So we're going to start, and there's lots to these reports, and these reports are often hundreds of pages long. But we're going to start looking at 4 reports, which is really actually simpler than it seems. This gigantic report, a lot of the key information comes in 4 statements. And those are all contained in what's called the basic financial statements. And there's also some discussion in this, which is known as the management's discussion and analysis. So let me show you here. I thought I was going to click on that. Let me try and click on it again here. So what we're going to do is, all right, I'm going to bring up this comprehensive financial report. So now the first thing you notice when you bring up this report is that, and by the way, before I do this, let me show you where this is. If you go into Canvas and you go under modules on the left side of your screen, you'll see all this information. You'll see both the PowerPoint that I'm using for today. You'll also see you'll see budgets that we just talked about the United States budget, and I'll go a little bit more into these state and local budgets in a moment. And tomorrow too. But then some of the information I'm showing you now is a prelude to day 2. So Evanston is listed here under day 2. It's called the Evanston FY20 audit. And the reason I'm showing you Evanston first as opposed to, say, Chicago or the state of Illinois is it's simpler. It's a smaller government. There's a little bit less going on. So you can either click on it here in Canvas, which will allow you to download it, or you can use the link on the page. Either way is fine. They'll get you to the same thing. So here we are, and we've got Evanston, Illinois. The first thing we notice right at the beginning is it's the title, but we notice the fiscal year, right? So this is the year in which we're doing the budgeting, or the budgeting for. So in this case, fiscal year ended December 31st. So in this case, Evanston operates on a calendar year, January 1st to December 31st. So we know that even before we're done with the first page. Now, the next thing, and this is quite important because this document, again, this is 206 pages, and it will feel overwhelming if you just try and scroll through and figure out what you're looking for. What's helpful here is it has a table of contents, and almost all documents, if they're prepared correctly, should have a table of contents, just like any good book would. Sorry, I was getting so excited about talking about this, I had to take a drink. So, there's a lot of things going on here. We're not going to talk about every single one of them tonight. But I want to point out a couple of things. The first thing you see is a management's discussion and analysis. And then you see basic financial statements. This is what I was just talking about. A lot of the meat and potatoes of what's going on in government in particular happens in these pages. These pages between page 4 and page 10, that's not very much space, but that's a ton of data about what's going on without you having to sift through the whole thing. Now there's more here, and we'll talk about that more, but the basic financial statements, it'll always be called that. It's not just what Evanston calls it. It will always be called the basic financial statements, and it'll always be relatively earlier in the document. It's not going to be the first part because that's the management discussion and analysis, but it's usually fairly early in the document. So we got two things: management discussion and analysis, basic financial statements, and those are what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, I'm going to scroll through some things because it tells us we're looking for pages basically 1 through 10 or so. So we're going to scroll. There's all this other stuff. Don't worry about this right now. It's a whole bunch of stuff that is very detailed, but all the detail is more information about what we see in the basic financial statements most of the time. So we're going to scroll here, statistical section. There's a lot of different things. Oh, well, how much water did we sell? Okay, well, that's great, but probably not necessarily what we want to know first. So we're scrolling through. Okay, first we got a little bit about who's in the city. That's great. Organizational chart. You keep scrolling. Oh, we've got a certificate of excellence. That's wonderful. Now, first we have some introductions. This is great. Introduction is not what we want. You can scroll. This just tells us a little bit about Evanston, what's going on. Scrolling through. And you're going to get to, keep scrolling. First you're going to get to management's discussion and analysis. Now, this is literally what it sounds like. The management's discussion and analysis is literally management telling you what's going on in this report. Now, take this for what it's worth. It's not in itself a regular financial statement. So read it, but realize this is management rating it for you. So management's always going to try and present it the way that they would like it. Not that that's a bad thing and not that it's wrong, but it's management's discussion. So you're going to read about it, and it has its opinion. The management has its discussions about what it thinks are significant financial issues. Does that actually mean that's what's really happening? It could be, but it's management's discussion. It is literally that. It's a discussion. That's it. So take this with a grain of salt because it's management's discussion. But it's interesting to read. This is what management thinks is going on. And you can read it all you want, but you don't need to really right at the moment. So we're going to kind of skip through this. There are numbers that are presented too, but keep in mind, this is management's discussion. Don't worry so much about it. Not for now, at least. So now, you keep scrolling, and sure enough, you will come upon basic financial statements. This is quite possibly the most important few pages of the document that you can find, because this is a summary of everything that is going on in this government. That's why it's called basic. It's not basic as in you're so basic. This is basic financial statements because this is the basics of what's going on. So there are 4 major statements within this. And I'm going to get into what each one of these is in the next session. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll to something called the Statement of Revenues, Expenditures, and Changes in Fund Balance. And that's going to be my intro to this next little step. So, this is the Statement of Revenues, Expenditures, and Changes in Fund Balance. And it specifically is for governmental funds. So this is basically just what government's doing. Now, you might say, well, isn't this only government? Sort of. There are things that governments do sometimes that are not considered governmental activities necessarily. So, for example, some things that government does operate more like businesses. So, for example, we sell water to people. Well, that's more like a business because you buy it, and if you use less of it, you pay less of it. You know, some municipalities might operate a golf course. Well, that operates also much more like a business. So we're right now focusing only on governmental funds. Now, there's a whole bunch of numbers here. And I remember at least some of you saying, hey, I don't love math. Don't worry. This isn't a whole bunch of math. It's a lot of numbers, but it's not a bunch of math. So, this is separated out into 3 broad categories. So, and just as it says at the top, revenues, expenditures, and fund balances. So first is revenues. At the top, revenues, this is what we're getting, where we're getting our money. And this is where we're getting our money. Literally listed right under the word revenues. This is where we're getting our money. Now you might say, why are there 4 different columns here? Well, the answer to that is there's different funds that are used by governments and other organizations. I'm going to talk about what these funds mean next session. But for now, let's just look at the total, because we know what a total is. We don't even have to think about math for this. But the total is literally, by the way, all these numbers in the first 3 columns added up. So this is the total amount of all these things. So, with this information, with this sheet alone, you can figure out where Evanston gets most of its money. And if you look at this, where do you see that is?
Taxes.
Taxes, yeah. So at the top here, we see that Evanston in this case gets $82.5 million in this particular year in taxes. So that is our top revenue source. Without even doing any math at all, we've already figured out where's the number 1 source of revenue for Evanston. And we can go down the list here. What's our number 2 source of revenue?
Intergovernmental.
Yeah, intergovernmental. So now you might say, well, what does that mean? Well, intergovernmental can be a lot of things. It can be money from the federal government. So in particular, things like COVID relief right now. So intergovernmental could be money from the federal government to Evanston. It can be money from the state government to Evanston. It can be money from other local governments to Evanston. So that's exactly as it sounds. It's intergovernmental, between governments. So there's your number 1 and number 2 source of revenue for Evanston. That's pretty neat. You don't even have to do math. You can say like, oh, well, how big are these, what are the big sources of revenue? Well, there you go. And you can also figure out how much. So yeah, Evanston got $82.5 million in taxes last year. That's kind of nice to know. And we'll get into this a little bit more next seminar, but you also notice what the total revenue for all of Evanston's all money is. So almost $140 million. That's how much the total revenue for the entire government is. $140-ish million, 139.6, we'll call it. So everybody see kind of where that is, the total there at the bottom? Kind of conveniently listed as total. And you could also figure out pretty easily what percentage any of these items are of the total. You would just take these whatever item you want and divide it by the total. So that would be, you could figure out, well, how much money are we getting from taxes? Well, how much are we relying on taxes? We can figure that out. So this is really neat. So for right now, and again, we'll get into what these other funds mean next class, but for right now, we're only looking at the total because that makes more sense. And then we say, okay, well, here's where the Evanston's getting the money. The next section, not shockingly, it says expenditures. This is where we're spending the money. So, just like before, we're looking at the total. We're looking at the very far right column for the total. And we could say, all right, well, what are the biggest things that Evanston spends money on? So, what do we see in this case? What is the biggest thing that Evanston spends money on?
Public safety.
Public safety, yeah. So, about $67 million in public safety. Now, sometimes, depending on what government you're looking at, public safety might be listed separately as police and fire. Typically, like when you see public safety listed, it's both. So this is, in this case, police and fire usually when you see public safety. But sometimes can be just police and sometimes can be just fire. You'll see it listed. So in this case, yeah, you're thinking about things like police, fire. And then, so I mean, we're saying, okay, $67 million of that is $67 million is public safety. So that's a big chunk of Evanston's budget. So, when we're thinking about how, where are we going to, cut spending or where are we going to increase spending, it's good to know first what we're actually spending money on. So, for example, let's say, and this can help you both as, as a resident of a community, as somebody that does budgets yourself. Let's say you've got somebody that says, you know what, I'm so sick and tired of Evanston spending so much money on parks and recreation and all that stuff. I want to cut the budget for that. Well, if you look at this list, you got about $9 million out of a $155 million budget. So even if you cut parks to zero, it's less than 10% of the budget. So when people go after some of these things, it's helpful to know exactly how much of the budget that represents. Well, not a lot, because chances are, in all honesty, you're never going to get cut parks to zero. You might cut the parks budget, but this is often kind of the common refrain of, oh, don't worry, I'll balance the budget. And you ask them, well, how am I going to balance the budget? Well, I'm going to privatize the parks. Oh, okay, well, that's not going to get you all that much money. Like, that's the thing. A lot of times when you hear these kind of claims about this is what I'm going to do with the budget, a lot of times it's not actually backed up by data. So it's nice to look at this section and say, okay, well, this is actually what we're spending the money on. And a nice thing you can do with this is look at it over time, too. So, how has, for example, the change, by the way, for those of you who are taking 402 with me in the spring, your quarter-long project, the paper you will write looks at your organization of your choice for 5 years, tracking spending and revenues over 5 years and seeing what's going on, making recommendations. It's actually a really fun project. So this is where we're spending the money. And then finally, we got fund balances. So now it's more complicated than this, but basically this is what money we've got left over. So, and we'll talk more about fund balances next week, I keep saying next week. We're not going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about this week, tomorrow. So fund balances, think about this as it's what you've got left over. And in some ways, you can kind of think about it as, rainy day fund savings, but it's not all that, because fund balance is broken down in much more detail. But this is basically some money we've got left. So, we can figure out, okay, this is, the money we've got, for example, if we ran a deficit for a year. Now, you might say, well, how would I figure out if I ran a deficit for a year? Well, you would do it just like you would in your normal budget, your actual personal budget. So, you compare how much you took in to how much you spent. So, which is more, revenues or expenditures?
The expenditures are greater.
Yeah, not only are they greater, but if you look right below the expenditures, they're greater by $15 million. Now, this probably should not surprise you for COVID, because this is December 2020. This is a really bad year for most governments. So you're going to see, if you look at financial statements for most governments and for the fiscal year that's 2020, you're going to see a whole bunch of deficits. So, the question is, well, would you be concerned about this? It's hard to say. You'd probably want to get more years of the past. If Evanston was doing okay in 2019, 2018, 2017, and this particular year really has a tough time, it might not be so bad, right? We can go down to the fund balances and say, we've got kind of $50 million or so that's left over that we could potentially, use. Evanston, in this case, you notice this section says other financing sources. What Evanston did in part was they issued some bonds, they borrowed some money. But you can kind of see pretty easily where the money's coming from, where the spending's happening, is there a deficit or a surplus, and where the fund balance is. So they've got a fund balance of about $52 million at the beginning of the year, and about $51 million at the end of the year. So it shows you what happens. It shows you what happens from the beginning to the end. That's why the statement is called changes in fund balance. It shows you what happened throughout the year. So it's kind of a neat little thing to be able to look at one document. We are literally looking at one page in a 200-page document, and I can pretty easily summarize what's going on in this government without having to do a whole bunch of math. Now, I could calculate percentages if I wanted, again, but I could easily tell you top 5 revenues, top 5 expenditures. I can tell you whether they're running a deficit or a surplus, by how much. One page. It's really neat. Eleanor says, is that why the jurisdiction likes to have a rainy day fund? Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah, if you've got a deficit, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about rainy day funds, but yeah. So that's exactly why you want to have a fund balance. So if, for example, one year you have a year like COVID, oh shoot, we can't get enough revenue, and we're spending a lot of money. Sometimes we're even spending more than we thought because maybe we're dealing with public health. Yeah, if having that rainy day fund can really help us, and it'll help us get through. We've got extra money in the bank. We can spend that money instead of borrowing, or we could spend that money instead of cutting services, and that can be really important. That's a great point. Yeah, rainy day funds. Now the fund balance itself, when you see it on this statement, not all of this is rainy day fund, but some of it you can think of as that. And we'll talk a little bit more about what part of it's rainy day and what part can be spent. Some of it can't be spent as easily. So like if you think about a nonprofit organization, like even if you think about a university has money in the bank, but it also has an endowment. And the endowment's not something that you can easily just spend. The money could be spent. Yes, it is possible, but it's really hard to spend some of that money. And fund balances for governments are kind of like that. Some parts of fund balances are really easy to spend, and some parts of fund balances are really hard to spend. So from this one statement, one page, you can tell a ton about what's going on. And this is what we're really going to go through in more detail tomorrow, too. We're going to go through it in more complicated versions. Evanston's a pretty simple version. So tomorrow we're going to talk about what do we mean by these funds? And what if it's more complicated than this? Like the city of Chicago's got multiple pages that go all together. What if you're like the state of Illinois and you've got a bunch of different sources or a bigger budget? Or what if you're even New York City? Huge municipality. Billions of dollars. So just for reference, New York City spends more money as a city than the state of Illinois does as a state. So it's really some big differences, but the financial statements are presented exactly the same way, no matter what organization or government you're looking for. So it's kind of a neat little thing. I keep using the word neat. I don't mean to. So that's government. But nonprofit organizations also have this information. So nonprofits, you could even argue, are a little bit even easier. So here's United Way. Same thing here. I've got it posted on Canvas, or you can just click the link on the presentation. So this is literally the tax organization, tax return rather. So the first page is just about the organization. But if you go to page 2, literally page 2, This is what the United Way is doing. We've got a huge summary in one page. You think that these 200-page documents are super complicated and crazy hard to understand, but they're not, because most of the information you really need is on one page. So now there's more to it, of course, and we're going to go through some of it. But for IRS Form 990, one page. We've got our total revenue. This is for 2019. Total revenues, both in the prior year and the current year, right in this middle part, under what Part 1 summary. We've got a section that says revenue. We've got a section that says expenses. So we automatically see that and you can see what they spent it on or what they're getting. So United Way, for example, gets a bunch of money from contributions and grants. Not that surprising. People donate to the United Way. This is how they get a lot of money. Program service revenue. So they're running programs, but they're charging for that. Investment income and other revenue. So it's kind of, you can see exactly where the money's coming from, exactly how much they're getting. And then you've got a section for expenses. United Way also ran a deficit. They spent about $8 million more than their revenue. So you can really easily find this, just one page. It's really kind of a neat thing that you can look at one page like this and figure out very easily what is going on financially in your organization. So this is a little different here. Instead of, in a financial report, you're looking at an IRS Form 990, but the idea is quite similar for both a nonprofit organization and a government. So this is what's going on there. And again, real easy to get these. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about how to find these and where you can get them when we talk tomorrow. But really, it's literally always called the Form 990. You can pretty much Google any nonprofit organization and then write in Form 990. There are a couple of different organizations that provide that house Form 990s. One is called ProPublica, and another one is called GuideStar. Both of them are nice hosts of these Form 990s that you can get. So, I just presented a whole bunch of information, and I did say that I wanted to make sure that I wasn't exhausting everybody, making you sit here for 2.5 hours every night. So I wanted to give you some time to ask questions, or if you don't have questions, I wanted to give you time to have a nice rest of your evening. So I put my email address here on the screen. You can email me anytime, but again, you can also, I'm going to give you some time to ask questions now, and feel free to stop by anytime on the 7 o'clock every night between now and next Sunday, including next Sunday. And we're just feel free to drop in and ask questions. Even if you don't stay for the whole time, that's okay. You can always stop by, ask some questions, and if you have to go, you can go. If you have to drop in late, that's okay too. It's not like a traditional class where you have to be here for every single second of it. Make this useful for you. So let me ask you first, what questions do you have for me? Do you have questions, or are there things that you would like to ask? No? Okay, that's fine too.
All right, Professor, I have one question.
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned there was two budgets. One is more like a wish list draft type of thing, and then one is what they actually implemented. What were the names of that?
So there's a couple of different things. So there's the budget itself is a plan. It's not, when you look at an organization's budget, like the City of Chicago budget, that was what they planned to do for the year. That is the budget. Then there is the audited financial statement, which is also known as the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. The comprehensive financial report is audited, and that is the actual amount of what happened in that past year. So the budget is prospective, the financial report is retrospective. Now with that, there's also, even within budgeting, there's a couple different budgets. There's the proposed budget by the executive, then there's the enacted budget. So the proposed budget, the executive, sometimes you might hear the executive budget. So the executive can come and say, here's what I propose we spend money on. And again, you're going to see Joe Biden propose a budget, And Joe Biden can propose whatever budget Joe Biden wants to propose. And I guarantee you that budget will not pass exactly as he proposes it. Because he's going to pass it off to Congress. And Congress then makes modifications to it. And that then is the enacted budget, basically the budget put into force. Now again, that's still, so there's the proposed budget by the executive, that usually doesn't get adopted because it's what the executive would like to see and it's suggestions. Now, some parts of it are adopted, but the whole thing is usually not adopted in its entirety. That is modified and then the legislature passes it. That's the passed budget, the enacted budget. And then the budget is actually done throughout the year. We implement it and we spend the things that we say we're going to spend. And then at the end of the year, we prepare this document called the financial report. You'll see it's usually the annual comprehensive financial report, but you can also, sometimes you just see it called the audit. Same idea, and that's audited by, again, some other outside person or agency, so it can be an accounting firm, it can be the Governmental Accountability Office. It's a lot of different organizations that can be part of that. So yes, the financial reports are a retrospective. That's the actuals. These are audited numbers. The budget is prospective. This is what we plan to spend the money on, but we might not actually hit those numbers, right? Like if you might have had a budget pre-COVID, and there's probably no way you actually hit your budget because that's what we planned, but it's not what we actually did. So when you're trying to figure out, it depends on what you want to know, which document you want to look at. If you want to know what the plan is, like if you hear that, hey, City Hall is going to hold budget hearings. When you hear budget hearings, okay, well that is talking about what we're proposing. We haven't actually done it yet. This is what we want to do. But if you want to know what's actually going on in terms of what they actually did spend the money on, that's when you would want to look at an audit or an audited financial statement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Absolutely. Stephanie.
Hey, everything you showed us today, are those documents up to like a GASB, like GAAP standard? And
Yes.
I think eventually I'll be able to make the distinction, but and maybe there's another night where we're going to talk about like cash basis accounting. And
Yes.
I'm just curious if what you showed today, is that applicable to both, or is it really just the format that we looked at was a GASB presentation?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. So we will talk more about accounting. Accounting is going to happen in day 3. But so, for example, the audited financial statement is actually a mix of auditing accounting approaches. So the statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balances presented in something known as a modified accrual form of accounting, and which is very specifically used by governments. So that's, and we'll talk a little bit more about what's cash, what's modified accrual, what's a full accrual, because in the basic financial statements, 2 of the statements are presented in full accrual, and then 2 of them are presented in modified accrual. And then actually, some governments also present a cash basis as well. So for example, the Illinois presents the detailed annual report, which is even longer than the 200 pages audited financial report, and that's on a cash basis. So generally, when you're looking at audited financials, those are either modified accrual or accrual, but we'll talk more about which one of those we'll talk about. So it's the balance sheet and the statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balance. Those are both on a modified accrual basis. The statement of net position and the statement of activities, those are on a full accrual basis. But we'll talk more about what that means and why we would want to do that and which documents are presented in which way. Yes, that's a great question. So yeah, for those of you who are not familiar with the terms I'm using, so basically these are different ways of presenting the same kind of financial information for an organization. It depends on kind of what you want to show. And there's reasons we do that. So for example, when we use what's called accrual accounting, we want to show things that we're going to owe in the future, and that's something known as, we might want to show that, hey, we've got a bill that we're going to have to pay in the future. We've got pension obligations that we're going to have to pay down the line, and we use accrual accounting to show that. Whereas cash accounting shows, well, here's how much cash we've got, but we might not have an effect of, say, pensions on cash immediately. Does that make some sense? We will talk more about that, though.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And great question. Thank you for asking. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit, a lot more about accounting in day 3. But yeah, so what we're basically showing is that when we're doing these types of, when we're looking at these reports, we're trying to determine. So, for example, are we more focused on how much cash we have right now, in which case that we might want to use a cash basis of accounting. If we're more concerned about, we want to show fairly that we've got pension obligations down the road, yeah, accrual or modified accrual accounting might be more appropriate there. Great question. Okay. Well, hearing no more questions, we'll call it a night. So it's 8:30, and my guess is most of those workshops will probably go about this time, hour and a half, something around there. If we go long, if you've got more questions, I'm always happy to stick around. And if anybody, and this is true of any night too, if you want to stick around and ask a question after others have left, and you don't want to ask it in front of everybody, that's fine too. You're more than welcome to do that. I'm always happy to help with that. So basically what happens now is that once we end this call, Zoom starts to process it, which takes, again, usually a couple of hours before it'll alert me that, hey, the recording is ready. As soon as the recording is ready, I'll get an alert. I then have to upload it. It then takes a bit to upload and process. So by midnight tonight, you'll see that link. It'll say, week 1, day 1 recording. And so everything that you've seen in tonight's lecture, you will also be able to then see in at any time that you would like. And I also do, I make these talks available for you even after this workshop is over. So you will be able to access them later if you need to. If you're taking 402 in the winter with Professor Payton and you want to look at it, you can always do that. Or again, if you're taking the 402 with me in the spring, again, you can do that as well. All right. Well, in that case, I'm very glad to have all of you in the workshop. Thanks for coming by. Hopefully I'll see a few of you tomorrow. Again, don't feel bad if you can't, but welcome anybody that would want us to join tomorrow. We're going to get really into the more details of the financial statements. We've only covered one of 4 big basic financial statements. There's also more. We have notes to the financial statements. So we're going to get into that in much more detail tomorrow. So on that note, have a great night, everybody. Really great to have you in the workshop. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor.
Absolutely. Have a great night.